Tonight is our first event of the new academic year. Our three speakers will discuss the past, present, and future of labour in the global tech economy. In just over 2 weeks' time, on Thursday, the 22nd of October at 6 p.m, our next event is called Women Workers Organising for Labour Standards, from Protest to Policy. And we'll be joined with the main speaker, Eileen Boris, from the University of California, Santa Barbara, with comments from Dana Barrett of Hand in Hand, the Domestic Employers Network, Senator Karen Kaiser, who represents Washington State's 33rd Legislative District, and Kasi Pereña, the new Director of Racial and Gender Justice at the Washington State Labor Council. To learn more about the Center and our upcoming events, please go to the website that you can see listed on the page right now, but that would be labor.uw.edu. Tonight's event is additionally sponsored by the Washington State Labor Council, the Washington State Education and Research Center, located on the South Seattle College Georgetown campus. And the third sponsor is the Washington chapter of the Scholars Strategy Network. If you have questions for our speakers, I invite you to submit them in writing to the Zoom Q&A function that you can see at the bottom of your screen. You can submit questions anytime. We will be addressing as many as possible in the final segment of our event. So now let me introduce this evening's speakers in the order that you will be hearing from them. Margaret O'Mara is the Howard and Francis Keller Endowed Professor of History at the University of Washington. She is also the contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. She writes and teaches about the growth of the high-tech economy, the history of US politics, and the connection between the two. Her most recent book is The Code, Silicon Valley, and the Remaking of America, and you can see that there on the screen. She will be followed by Mary Gray, who is a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research and faculty associate at the Bergman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Her research looks at how technology access, material conditions, and everyday uses of media transform people's lives. Her most recent book is Ghost Work: How to Stop Silicon Valley from Building a New Global Underclass, and that's co-edited with Sid Suri. And I have additionally very exciting news. She heard today that she is going to be a MacArthur Fellow. We're very excited about that. And then she will be followed by Kimberly Earles, who holds a PhD in political science from York University in Toronto, Canada, focusing on gender, employment, and public and social policy. She has consulted with nonprofits, government agencies, unions, labor organizations, and public institutions. She is the author of the very recently report, The Gender Divide in the Tech Sector, a plan to address the bias and change the culture. The report was produced for the Washington State Labor Education and Research Center and SEIU 925. And you can find it on the website that you see listed there. So let's hear from our speakers.
Thank you so much, Kim. And I've unmuted myself, hold on, okay. Hi, I'm Margaret O'Mara. It's great to be here. I wanted to start off just by talking for a few minutes about what I learned in the course of researching and writing my latest book about tech labor, and my thoughts about how we historicize the landscape of tech labor that we see today. Where right now, when you think of the tech industry, it's not just, you think about many parts, it's business culture. It's Silicon Valley's business culture, which is often epitomized by certain slogans. You have Apple's Think Different. You have Facebook's one-time informal slogan, move fast and break things, although they've backed away from that lately. But those ideas are not ones that came out of thin air. And I think they're very important in understanding the work culture of not just white collar Silicon Valley, the part of the giant iceberg of tech labor that we see and that often is associated with the tech industry. And when I used Silicon Valley, I should say, I'm kind of using that interchangeably to speak for the modern American-led tech industry, because that is dominated by 5 companies, 2 of which are in Seattle. But these ideas about the work and workers have a long history. And so what I trace in the book are kind of how the tech's modern day work culture and part of the things that have made it so unequal and where a great deal of benefits flow to some, but not to all, have its roots in American history and deeper than you think. The first kind of original Silicon Valley company kind of set the tone and was very much consciously imitated by many other companies was Hewlett-Packard. So Hewlett-Packard is founded in 1939 by 2 engineers, David Packard and Bill Hewlett, who were very much creating a company that was designed to be the antithesis of what corporate America was then. So think about this. Think about the 1940s and the 1950s, the organization man, the man in the gray flannel suit, the hierarchy of the corporation. And Hewlett and Packard wanted to create a company that was much more like the engineering labs that they had come up in. They were engineers. And they wanted to create a more non-hierarchical work environment where if you were doing good work, you got recognized and promoted. They practiced what they famously called either management by wandering or management by walking around, which was rather than being ensconced in corner offices, that executives would move around. And it was much more informal. People wore shirt sleeves. They'd play horseshoes out back. It was kind of setting the tone for these later companies to come. But the other thing about Hewlett-Packard, and one of the kind of founding ideas, was that one of the other ways it didn't want to be like a usual corporation was that they saw unions and unionization as a sign that something was wrong with the management, that if you had antagonism between rank and file and executives, that meant you were doing it wrong, that's what old school companies did, and companies like HP were going to do it differently. And instead, they offered people stock options, a stake made them stakeholders in a collective future of the company. And they also, like many other tech companies after them, fiercely opposed unionization or other collective action that would have strengthened workers' rights on terms that weren't set by the founders and the executives. The tech has consistently resisted that sort of unionization, formal unionization, and kind of collective worker action for business reasons as well. And again, this has roots in history. If we look at the companies that made Silicon Valley, the silicon semiconductor companies, the microchip companies that start cropping up there and become a very significant industry in the 1960s and into the 1970s, having a unionized workforce, or more precisely, having a workforce that you couldn't very easily upsize and downsize, was something that didn't work well with the business model. They had to move very, very quickly, bring new products to market, be able to retrofit factories very quickly. They needed to be able to upsize and downscale production very quickly. This need for speed and the scale fast mentality that still drives Silicon Valley to this day was one reason that companies like Intel and National Semiconductor and other semiconductor companies were among the first to offshore manufacturing labor. Because keep in mind, for the first decades of Silicon Valley, it was a hardware-driven place, building things, and a lot of that manufacturing originally happened in the valley. So you had a blue-collar workforce well into the 80s. But after that, that workforce starts moving overseas and becomes part of this hidden workforce, a larger hidden workforce that's part of what Mary has explored in her work, that tech is not sort of magically produced by software and algorithms, it's produced by people. So I'll have more to say about the other things baked into tech's history that help us understand these dynamics of tech labor, but I'll leave it here, I'll leave that for the discussion, and I'll turn it now over to Mary.
Hey everybody, Margaret, thanks for beginning the conversation. I'm so excited to be here with you because I feel like your work and the most recent book that you've authored, The Code, really sets up this history that is the touchstone that I think we should all have in mind, that this is our current conditions, our current labor conditions are not new. It's not the result of disruptive technology that arrived just last month or even last decade. I mean, we've been watching businesses drive toward managing workforces and dismantling labor, the power of labor over time. So I want to pick up where you left off, which is thinking, how do we end up in this place where we're chasing automation and yet still find the proliferation of work? And the argument that my co-author, Siddharth Suri, a computer scientist at Microsoft Research, and I offer is a notion of what we call the paradox of automation's last mile. So in fact, as technologies are trying to automate, they can automate some work, but think about what work they're automating. It's really information services. They're automating an experience that you might be seeking as an end consumer. But along the way, this information service work is creating a new workflow, a new stream of task, project-based work that depends on demands human expertise. And I wanted to take the time I have to just kind of unpack that mechanism, because it's a really particular mechanism. Like, how does chasing automation effectively dismantle, rather than eliminate, but actually dismantle full-time employment? Like, that's the target that we are asking readers and thinkers to watch. And here's how it works. Is that, since the development of the internet as effectively a distributed database that can move, can move information across different systems, so that someone in another part of the world can do financial analysis, business analysis of all kinds, any kind of information management, then businesses, which is painfully obvious right now, can take any task that demands attention, that can be packaged as just a moment that you can place on a platform. And with just a little bit of application programming interfaces, the smallest amount of AI, often no AI at all, and most importantly, the internet, businesses can match up to legions and legions of people who have signed up on accounts to be able to look at that task that's just sitting up on a website, check out that task, and then perform whatever that task demands. And that's the world of work that we're watching in our research. The value proposition is a blending of moments of human creativity and code. So you have businesses with tasks that demand attention, everything from, hey, I'd like to get a ride to the airport, to, hey, I'd like somebody to look over my taxes before I submit them. And on the other side of this platform labor market is not just one person who's supplying that moment of labor, that insight, that response to the hail for a ride to the airport, the response to look over taxes, but many people. And so what a consumer is getting is not just someone's availability, but an abundance of people who have the potential to serve you as the end consumer. And that includes businesses that are serving each other. So there's a long labor supply chain that we're talking about here. And I want to get really concrete. We call this work ghost work. We're really talking about the labor conditions. It's not a niche job. It is literally the reorganization of employment, the taskification, if you will, that reduces the labor conditions to a short contract where someone is doing something that can be executed through an interface of some kind. And that can mean online to offline delivery of a service like food or a person to an airport, But increasingly, the world of work we were studying, it wasn't just to train artificial intelligence to get rid of a person. It was to provide what's called human-in-a-loop services. So it might be concierge customer service that can be the text at the end of, say, a health exchange where you're being prompted to take particular medication and there's a nurse navigator who's waiting to step in when you don't respond to your auto text. That's a business. That's a business that relies on this model. And we argue that this is a world in which the value and really the presence of people working is erased. It's certainly eroded, but in many cases it's elided precisely because the value that a business is offering is the magic of automation. In some cases, businesses actually believe that magic, and I think, Margaret, your research can speak to just the way in which engineers and computer scientists can be taken away by their own ideas of how successful can they be with automation and how they can quickly lose track of who might be doing this work. So my colleague and I studied this world both through traditional anthropological methods, the types that I use, where you're sitting in front of somebody and they're telling you about their day-to-day in front of a screen, the kinds of work that they do, how long it takes them, but also what else are they trying to achieve in their lives? How do they make sense and create meaning out of this work? And the kind of work we're looking at, like I said, there's really two streams to this last mile of the paradox of automation. One is this continuous stream of data that we're all creating as end users in a world of social media, but also think health, where you're, part of creating an electronic medical record, and companies trying to squeeze value out of information data that's sometimes just a pile of stuff, and they need it annotated, they need it organized. So people are doing something called data labeling, where they're adding some sort of tag that can tell a business that wants to be able to reuse data that, hey, that's the image of a tumor, and trying to identify what kind of tumor that might be. That's a really important part of what data labeling entails. But this is also the world of content moderation, which when I'm talking about this research, I think a couple of years ago, no one would have understood that content moderation is done by a content moderator. To me, it's the contemporary version of talking about a computer. These are people who are often tasked with looking at material precisely because it's very difficult for computation to sort anything without some ground truth that's provided by people. The example that we have in the book that I love to turn to is thinking about the debates in the presidential debates, where the phrase "binders full of women" was uttered, and thousands of workers contributing to Twitter's content review had to sort through what did that mean. And you have to have some context and domain expertise to understand that's an utterance by a presidential candidate rather than a jumble of words. Arguably, it's both those things. But the other stream of work is also really important for us to discuss tonight, which is this growing world of human-in-the-loop information service work. And that's people generating leads, sales leads for companies. It's content moderation that continues to be done by people, translation and captioning of video, because moving image is actually quite hard to automatically detect or understand. And it's the world of telehealth. Things like contact tracing are part of this world of having somebody at the end of a screen, at one end of a screen, perhaps hitting out pre-formulated automated strings of messages to someone, a text message, and then a person being brought into that loop when the computation hits a wall or it fails. So these two worlds of work are what we're asking people to pay attention to. We studied people in the United States and India. We surveyed thousands of people and interviewed hundreds of those people within that set to be able to understand over an almost 2-year period, how many people stay in this world, how many people leave, why do they stay, why do they leave, who jumps in and out. And the key insight I wanted to bring to you all today was to think about this world of work is not one type of worker. So often when we're superficially studying this world, we're seeing the most visible people who might be immediately available to a journalist, or might be understood quantitatively by studies of Uber, looking at data points of drivers moving around. But what's lost is this much more complicated, rich world of people moving into labor markets, often working for more than one platform, where they sign up to pick up tasks. And there's a small percentage of people who turn this into their main form of income. They're often working on multiple platforms. They might, think of the folks who are working on both Uber and Lyft. Well, they might also be working on Upwork. And so that's a labor platform specifically for knowledge work. There's about 10% of people we call always on who are doing the lion's share of work. But there's also this really important group of people, we call them regulars, and it's about 20% of the people who are active on any platform, where they've picked a price point, they've picked a number of hours, they've picked a particular kind of project that they find interesting, or that they choose to do because it's something that they can easily knock out and earn some cash. And they are this deep bench that makes these labor markets possible, because they're a stable workforce that is available alongside people who are always on. And then there's a long, long tail. A good 70% of the people who come into these labor markets try it. We call them experimentalists, who are testing out, can this be a source of income for them? Can this be a source of experience that builds their portfolio if they do a small design or a logo, or write some content, or do some surveys? Is it teaching them something? And that long tail is the pipeline into becoming a regular, or someone who's always on. And people, importantly, jump around across those three different work types. So when we talk about regulating this labor market, the biggest challenge, what we found, is that there isn't a single mental map that people have for the work that they do. You can talk to someone who's always on, and they might identify as someone, as we asked folks, when they describe their work to other people, you might have somebody who does this all the time, who identifies with the Silicon Valley startup they work with. So they'll say they work for a Silicon Valley startup. A worker who's on the same platform might say that they're an entrepreneur, that they're bringing jobs to their friends and family, which we also found, people who are effectively subcontracting out tasks that they collected and then passed on to others. And then others might just say they're self-employed or they're freelancing, and there wasn't real clear distinction between those two things. The issue is that we don't have one word for what it means to be participating in these markets. So that makes labor organizing challenging. And it also means taking at face value that when a worker has a different relationship to this work, that we have to start there to understand what's going to build connection and solidarity and action for their needs. So the most important thing I hope to put on the table is that our research suggests we should be thinking about this new world of work, not as breaking with the past, but really at the zenith. We've come to the place where what's left is service economies. We know this about our economy. It's mostly driven by service jobs, and that information services are a large part of that economy. And that information service work doesn't have a single work site. Think today what it means to be working from home. There isn't a sole employer of record in these environments. There are multiple businesses trying to meet finite needs, as Margaret was describing, where people are scoping not just a product, but a service they're offering to customers that will fade as that service is no longer particularly interesting to end consumers. There's no unifying professional identity or career track. And this is a globally networked, independent workforce that has to contend with the legacy of colonialism and labor arbitrage as part of its work backdrop. And lastly, and I think most profoundly fascinating about this world of work, is this notion that it is the aggregated value. It's not individual achievement here. It is people being collectively bound together through service on these platforms. And they're offering this abundance, this availability, this potential. I like to describe it as nobody opens a car, a ride-hailing app and wants to see just 2 cars who might be available in 20 minutes. You go with the platform that shows you 5 cars who could pick you up 5 minutes from now when you might be ready to walk out the door. That's what all of these services are offering to an end consumer who's not paying for that cost. That's part of our challenge here. And then lastly, there's really arguably, and hopefully this will be a productive generative argument tonight, there are no labor laws that govern on-demand contract employment right now, that we have a desperate need to set the bar, at the very least a floor, but can we do better? Can we say that this is now an orientation to service work that forces us all to value service to each other? And we have a history of doing a poor job at that. And hopefully this is our chance to redress our past of not being able to reckon with the value of service to each other. So with that, I'll pass it on to the next speaker.
Okay, hi everyone. So I'm going to be talking about white collar tech workers in the Seattle area, so a little more specific. And in the past decade, we've heard a lot about the pipeline problem and how we can get more girls and women into careers in tech. But we've heard far less about what happens to women once they are in tech. My research revealed a serious retention problem because of the way women and gender nonconforming folks are treated within tech. This project adds to the existing literature on gender in Silicon Valley by adding the voices of Seattle area tech workers, which is important because, as Margaret pointed out, 2 of the biggest tech companies are headquartered here, Microsoft and Amazon. So diversity and inclusion have become buzzwords in the tech industry, but little progress has been made in these areas. Today, women occupy just 24% of tech jobs, and even less at Microsoft, Google, and Facebook, and Amazon doesn't make this information public. The higher up you go in the senior ranks and in leadership, the fewer women you will find in tech. There's a high cost to this attrition. Losing all of these talented, educated, and skilled workers is a tremendous loss, period. It's also estimated to cost about $144,000 to replace the average tech worker. And it costs the industry as a whole about $16 billion annually. So retention is not just a gender issue, it's a business and a financial issue as well. When I interviewed 48 tech workers last year, with very few exceptions, I heard the same story over and over again. Women and gender nonconforming folks are often the only one on their team and in the room. They feel their voices are not heard, their ideas are not valued, their skills and expertise are diminished, and really there's no way for them to win within a system that's rigged against them from the start. And this makes going to work every day in such an unwelcoming environment a really emotionally draining task, and at least partly explains why so many leave tech. I heard a lot about daily microaggressions, sexual harassment, unfair hiring practices, promotion and pay problems, high rates of attrition, as I mentioned, and a lack of support for parents. I don't have time to discuss all of these issues right now, so I'll focus mainly on microaggressions and some of the ways that they're connected to the other issues, but we can continue the discussion if you have any questions about the other areas. The daily microaggressions in particular seem to be the source of most despair amongst the people I spoke to. Things like being constantly interrupted in meetings, lack of eye contact, people not answering your emails, only the men in the room being addressed, being yelled at, not seeing your achievements being equally recognized, and having to prove your technical skills over and over again, that you are an engineer and that you know what you're talking about, or that you're a data analyst and you know what you're talking about. I heard of some extreme tactics to deal with these microaggressions, such as having male colleagues send emails to get quicker responses to keep your project moving along, as well as having a male colleague repeat everything you say on a call so that your ideas are heard by the other men on the call. Many of the interviewees have adopted a lower work voice and avoid using words like maybe and I think, so that their ideas are heard and put forth in a more confident manner. A software engineer at Amazon told me about being continuously interrupted in meetings, even when she's asked to answer questions. And when she spoke up about it, she was reported to her manager, who then told her this kind of thing could block your promotion. In the end, many interviewees complained about the extra effort they have to put in to be heard, to convince their colleagues that they know what they're talking about and are able to do their jobs. This whole extra job that's required in order to do their actual job takes an emotional toll. In doing the research, there appears to be no simple answer or solution to microaggressions. Most research points to individual solutions, so how you should react or not when the victim or witness to a microaggression. But in order to create an environment free from microaggressions in the first place, a real change in culture is required, which I'll address in a little bit. One strategy used by many in tech to find a more friendly work environment is to change teams or orgs, basically your team or the product you work on, to work with more women or with a more supportive manager. Many tech workers put their happiness at work down to the manager and the team culture that the manager creates. As a result, many change teams in order to try to find a better team culture, even knowing that this could cause delays in promotions and promotion velocity. The problem in tech, though, is that there are regular reorganizations. So even if you find a supportive manager or team, that situation can be upended at any moment when there's a reorganization. Several interviewees spoke of such a situation where they had done the work to find a supportive team, only to have a reorg happen where a new male manager was brought in, and with him often comes many of his favorite male employees from his last team, changing the gender composition of the team and the culture of the team. And within a very short time, I heard this over and over again, every woman on that team is either forced out or leaves voluntarily because the team is no longer what they were looking for and becomes a sort of a toxic place to work. There appears to be no accountability for male managers who lose all of their female colleagues and reports. And this should definitely be a red flag and something that tech needs to deal with. An example of this shared with me was a situation where multiple women were sexually harassed by their new male manager within a month of him being hired. When they complained to HR, they were told he had just moved across the country with his family, so no action would be taken. There are also many problems in tech when it comes to hiring, pay, and promotions, from the language that is used in job ads, to literally leveling women down to lower level positions, to not promoting women equally with men. Within tech, women are often concentrated in non-technical jobs, and even within the tech jobs, women are often steered into lower level, less prestigious, and lower paying engineering tracks. It also appears that many women feel that in order to move up in tech, they sort of have to move into people management. And there's not really a clear path into the senior engineering ranks for women. Many lawsuits have been filed over sexual harassment and discrimination, such as this, and many women feel stuck at mid-level. A senior PM at Microsoft shared that women get passed up for promotion while men are failing upwards. Women and gender nonconforming folks also receive, or tend to receive, harsher performance reviews. They're often called bossy, aggressive, and assertive in negative ways. Within tech, and particularly at Amazon, there is definitely a boys' club culture that encourages aggressive behavior, arguing, tearing apart other people's ideas. But this system really only applies to the men. When women behave this way, they are punished for it because they are behaving outside of the gender norms. However, they're also punished when they behave politely and collaboratively because these are skills that are not valued to the same degree within tech. As one UX designer at Amazon put it, there is a really fine line for how women can behave. In terms of solutions to these problems, I've outlined more than 60 in the report, but the biggest one, which will have the most impact, is a change in culture. This requires a commitment from the CEO and other top executives, making it clear which values are important and what types of behavior will be tolerated and not. From microaggressions to sexual harassment, gender performance reviews, etc. The most common solutions that tech companies have adopted so far is the creation of diversity and inclusion officers and offering unconscious bias training. The research shows that a diversity and inclusion officer alone, with no authority to affect real change, will be ineffective. Instead, this position should be part of a broader diversity and inclusion task force and the diversity and inclusion officer should report to the CEO. However, this is not the way that it is set up at any of the big 4 tech companies in Seattle. Unconscious bias training, the way it's currently offered, has also been proven to be ineffective. Instead, it should focus on capacity building and organizational change by arming managers and employees with the tools to make better decisions. But even a transformed, more useful unconscious bias training can only be effective if it's part of a larger diversity and inclusion initiative that includes, among other things, clear diversity goals and employee bonuses for diverse candidate referrals. I'll end with a little bit about tech worker activism, which has been talked about a little already. One of the goals of this project was that the women and gender nonconforming folks within tech would take this report and use it as a tool for organizing for change within their workplaces and the broader tech industry. While tech workers haven't traditionally been known for their activism, this is definitely something that's changing. In 2018, Wired magazine ran an article titled, "The Year Tech Workers Realized They Were Workers." And the following year, The Guardian found that of the 230 collective actions they could find in the tech industry since 1979, more than 100 of those had occurred in the year 2019. Tech workers are organizing around things like gender discrimination, childcare, sexual harassment, climate justice, working conditions for gig workers and warehouse workers. They're also organizing against company contracts with ICE and Customs and Border Protection. These collective actions are trying to shift the balance of power within the industry so that workers, the ones who actually design and build the products, have a greater say in how the products are used and in how they themselves are treated as workers. Last week, a new group of cross-company organizers called Disco Tech launched their first public campaign called #TechTruths, a collection of over 100 stories alleging widespread discrimination across the tech industry. Check them out on social media or at their website, which is discotech.tech. I want to thank all of the women and gender nonconforming folks who gave their time to share their stories with me, as well as the Washington State Labor Education and Research Center for entrusting me with such important research. And that's where I'll end, and hopefully we can continue the discussion.
Thanks. So as I'm going to be the kind of a commentator and a moderator for the rest of our conversation. And again, I encourage you guys to put questions in the Q&A, and I'll try and integrate them in. But I'm going to take moderators / presenters' prerogative and pick up where Kim left off and pick up on some of the things that Mary mentioned. This question of culture is, and the, you know, it's very interesting because some of the things that are techs that made West Coast tech, I won't say just Silicon Valley, made these companies so successful and these networks and the ecosystem so successful are also the things that help make them so exclusionary in terms of gender, in terms of underrepresented minorities, and also help kind of mask the very human dimensions of work that are necessitated, that there's no element of, you know, the computer that is, you know, that is moving forward without some sort of human intervention or interaction, or at least even in the design of the software, obviously. And this question and gender bias is deeply, deeply baked in. And there are three things that your report, Kim, which I think is so important and so sort of a really important read. One, it's showing this importance of, networks. Again, the fact that tech, the way that Silicon Valley grew, and it was very much based on people hiring people or funding people that they knew, or that looked like people they knew, what venture capitalist John Doerr infamously slipped up and called pattern recognition, meaning that, someone looks like some guy in a hoodie who got an engineering degree from MIT. Well, I'm going to invest in him. But also, which is something which is the startup hustle kind of demands, right? If you're working in a small scale entrepreneurial activity and you're 24/7 and you're sharing space and getting pizza together, it's useful to have someone and if you're in a kind of embarking on a risky business venture, it's useful to have this this sense of, okay, this is someone I can relate to in ways that transcend a pure business relationship. I think the tolerance of weirdness is also one of the things that makes tech culture, has made tech companies successful. Kind of, we don't care if you're weird and antisocial. If you're a really great programmer, we're going to create a space for you. People who would have not been tolerated at a Fortune 50 company, who like to work. I mean, young Steve Jobs is a classic example of that. He was in his, fruitarian phase and smelled funny and didn't bathe a lot. And so when he was working at Atari, he got to do the night shift so that no one really had to be around him. But there are other many examples of intense weirdness that was promoted and celebrated. But when you have tolerance of weirdness, that also goes along with tolerance of bad behavior. When I hear you talk about Amazon, Kimberly, I think about Intel and the other semiconductor companies of the 60s and early 70s and beyond. I think about Atari of the 70s, which was all about smoking pot and hanging out in the hot tub and just rolling with it. And if you couldn't hang with that culture and you were uptight, which, and it also kind of came with a certain just crossing boundaries of what was acceptable, every sexual harassment boundary, I'm sure, was crossed. But that was part of the culture. We're different than these other companies. We're building something new. We don't have these, we don't need an HR department because we're building something new. And so when you don't have that, you have this incredibly, what becomes, can be a very hostile workplace. We could spend the rest of the time with stories galore from past and probably contemporary that are of, show why tech has been such a gender exclusionary, or sort of more broadly exclusionary environment. And there, but I have one note of hope, I think is important, which is that in all my research, women particularly in tech, were complaining about this and noting these things and doing it to one another privately. And the companies themselves were never being called out. And in the last several years, I'm not saying the statistics haven't improved much, but at least we're having a public conversation. At least we don't say with utter lack of irony, well, Silicon Valley is a meritocracy and they just care about, people being good programmers, and they don't care if you're, what the color of your skin is or your gender. It does. The human bias is driving these environments, just like any human environment. It's society. It's not just tech. So, and then Mary, I think this relates to kind of this sort of myths of meritocracy, and also the ideas of who a tech worker is. I think it's so interesting, your work uncovering, as you emphasized in your talk, that there's not just one type of worker. And what, again, the conversation around tech work has changed a lot in the past few years, where it isn't just a bunch of geeks at the Googleplex, that actually, no, they're gig workers and they're Amazon warehouse workers. But even then, that conversation sort of proceeds on a binary, right? So you have the privileged people in the Plex, and then you have the people in the warehouse or at the, on the call center, or the, who are in the very ill-paid, very contingent jobs, or the people who are doing gig work. And the presumption too is the Uber driver is always driving Uber or Lyft and isn't doing anything else. And so with these many different shades of gray in between, Mary Gray, um, and the really interesting kind of the identification that some of these contingent workers have with the companies. I think too about contractors, white collar contractors, right? Which is another dimension of tech labor that I'm interested in kind of talking more about, is people who are, you know, they may have a badge that says I work at Google or I work at Amazon, but they're actually not FTEs. They're actually working for a private contractor. They're one step beyond, and they don't have the protections. They don't have the status, but they aspire to be someone. The story on eBay's shenanigans that was in last week's paper, the security team that was all made up of contractors who were made up of these young kids who really wanted to work at eBay and they weren't.
Yeah, I mean, Kimberly, when I read your report, what really struck me, the number of people we interviewed who had left formal employment, sector employment, precisely because they faced discrimination in the workplace. So the number of women who said, you know, I'm doing this work because I don't have to put up with harassment. I don't have to perform femininity in a particular way. The non-binary people we met who talked about not having to put up with the constraints of being in mostly service industry. So I think tracking how much of the world of developing software is a very long supply chain that includes marketing people, includes temp workers, contingent staff who are doing myriad projects that are feeding a larger scoped project. And within that, if you're a contingent worker, you are having to contend with office politics for the workers we talked with who could bring the capacities they'd built, whether it's particular kind of media literacy, being able to do beta testing, and not having to conform to the expectations of a temporary staffing agency, or try and get the relatively few FTE positions, was a part of their story about why they were giving this a go. And it in many ways, I'd say we're seeing the reflection of what is not working in formal employment. For us, that's why it was important studying India and the United States, comparing settings where formal employment in India is the exception. I mean, it's an 85% cash economy. And in most of the world does not participate in formal employment where you get a salary or even a wage. You are involved in informal service exchanges. So I believe we're seeing this technology of platformatization of structuring informal employment that is telling us what's dysfunctional about formal employment, or just the absence of formal employment that I think is also part of this conversation. But Kimberly, when you were describing your recent research, that's what stands out for me. And for the workers we interviewed, how critical it was for them to plug into networks. Like that was the jaw-dropping finding from my colleague Sid, who's a computer scientist, was that people would meet off of these platforms and exchange ideas. And when I talk to economists, I have to spend quite a bit of time explaining they did it for free. They're mentoring each other. Of course, women do that all the time because we have to, and perhaps we want to because we see other kinds of intrinsic value to that kind of exchange. But all of the workers who were regulars and experimental and always on talked about finding a network of people they could plug into who would help show them how to make this work manageable. Was the difference between this being manageable, navigable, and being impossible. All the experimentalists we talked with were people who never found that network, and it absolutely reproduced boundaries by language, by caste and class, by religion, by gender, by age, by past experience in the workplace. So, it both allowed people to escape some of what Kimberly's talking about, and also reinforced some of the norms, the pattern recognition, Margaret, that you just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, doing the research, the saddest thing that I found is that the vast majority of the women and gender nonconforming folks I spoke to actually really love their jobs. Like they love the work, they love being engineers or designers or data analysts or what have you. But the conditions within which they're able to do their work are so difficult and so different than they had imagined. You know, I heard several women say, well, I grew up with brothers, and so I was prepared for this. And I think that, you know, there is some recognition that tech is still a boys' club, and that you're obviously, as a woman, you'll be in the minority. But I think there's not a full understanding of how difficult and awful it can be. There's more of an idea, oh, I'll have to deal with these sort of antisocial guys. But there's not this idea that my work will be devalued, my skills will be devalued. I will have to constantly fight to have my voice heard and to have my ideas heard. And, I'll be pushed off my own projects by other men. And I think none of them knew any of that going into it. And so there's just this sadness that, I did all this training, I beat all these odds even just to make it there. But, by going through an engineering program or whatever it might be. And I really love the work, but I'm considering leaving because I hate coming here every day. And even when I surveyed the people I interviewed recently to see if things were better or worse while working from home, I kind of thought they might be better, but that's not what I heard, which was, again, sad. The instances of microaggressions seem to have, were the same or worse. Several people told me of, managers or other men on their team who didn't used to speak over them in meetings, who are now doing it regularly and interrupting them. And even recognizing that they're doing it and apologizing and still doing it constantly. So the fact that so many are considering leaving, so many think about it, so many have an exit strategy that they will employ at some point when they have made enough money, or they are at a certain point in their career, or when they have children, I find to be the saddest part of the whole situation, that there is a love for the actual work, which obviously shows that these, gendered ideas about who can be an engineer and who is, adept at doing this work are incorrect. It's more the confines of where you're doing the work and how you're treated while you're there that makes so many women and gender nonconforming folks, and I'm sure also underrepresented racial minorities, consider leaving, because it's a whole extra job to try to figure out how to navigate that world in a way that doesn't make you miserable on a daily basis.
And I think for the people we talked with, interviewed, studied, they didn't have the cultural capital, the cachet to get on the first rung of that ladder, to step into the, contingent work pool. And so, I think it's noteworthy, these were the majority of people we interviewed and surveyed had some, if not a completed bachelor's. I mean, the reality is this is not, we're talking about people who have a particular level of training, and what they don't have is what sociology of work has always told us gets you a job. It's the networks. Yeah. It's being able to get in those networks. For most of the people who found some toehold, they found it precisely because they were bootstrapping with colleagues, with peers, to figure out, well, how am I going to manage this work? And perhaps because, and I'm hearing in kind of what you're describing, Kimberly, because these are short-term tasks, they're oriented to projects that happen, are scoped, they're going to end within sometimes minutes, but maybe weeks. There's not as much time to build up and have to work with or against the kinds of microaggressions that are so typical of a workplace environment where people are, battling each other for scraps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, networks are so critically important. And I was thinking as you were speaking at first, Mary, about how immigrants, particularly Indian immigrants to Silicon Valley have become part of the secret of their success has been this network, you know, the Indian entrepreneurs, these actual organizations, but also informal ties, where so groups of immigrants that have successfully networked have been, you know, been able to kind of move up the value chain, so to speak. And I think this also gets me, you all have both have me thinking about, so what is a union? So why do, you know, if we really go back and kind of back into the sort of origins of trade unionism, well, it's a mechanism by which workers banded together to try to change the terms. They knew they didn't have the power individually, but collectively they could come together and change the terms of their employment and have some counterbalancing power with their employers. And I think one of the real challenges of kind of what's the new labor law or what's the new union is exactly what you described, Mary, which is this, you know, people are working for multiple employers at once. And then true, like with contractors too, they're working with multiple employers. And the tech industry, even at the highest levels, is notoriously job hopping. So people will kind of be bopping back and forth. And that's often how the white collar employees have chosen to, they've walked, you know, they've moved with their feet, they've voted with their feet. And when they aren't happy with their job, they leave. And someone pointed out to me once, actually I was having a conversation with a UW graduate student after a seminar last year in the before times. And we want to talk about COVID in a second, because there's a question coming in from the audience on that. Is that, you know, he was pointing out, you know, my friends are, you know, one of the reasons I think discontent is growing is because people are like, well, I'm unhappy with what Facebook's doing in the world, but where am I going to go? Google or Amazon? That you have these, you know, these companies that are offering so much money to people with a certain skill set that, so, you know, what I found in my work is that in the past, sure, there were plenty of tech people who didn't like where they worked. They just moved, they just left. And so, but going back to this network question kind of gets me thinking about, you know, I mean, the problem with tech, of course, is the dominant network is still predominantly white and male. Like it's still, that's the problem. And now it's been leavened with some, you know, South Asian, East Asian male, but it's still, you know, we still have this, and where we're seeing the needle move in investment is where you're seeing women and underrepresented minorities having their own exits. You know, they work at Facebook or Google and they come out with their own, you know, they're able to be angel investors. And so they decide, I'm going to start a fund and I'm going to invest in people like me. And they start building their own networks and have money to spread around. And, you know, capitalism. So I think that's a really interesting sort of thinking about the union as really, it's just a network. I mean, it's obviously much, much more than that. But when we really go back to the early industrial capitalism and think about these kind of mechanisms of power and worker power, we should expand our ideas of the different ways in which workers can both find common cause and solidarity within a workplace that can be hostile and also make meaningful change. But COVID, the audience is asking about how this crazy pandemic year is changing anything. You know, one of those things that's changed certainly has been the balance sheets of the biggest tech companies, which have just gotten more powerful. But I'm interested, Mary, what you and Kimberly, what you guys think of that.
I mean, for the people we worked with, things are challenging precisely because there are more people competing for project task-based work. You know, we can call it freelancing, we can call it whatever it is, but if you are furloughed and you know how to do design or writing or can do labeling of any kind, then you're now competing on the myriad platforms that are out there that let you sign up for an account and pick up tasks. So, you know, use eBay or Etsy and think it's effectively these marketplaces where people can present what they have to offer or pick up somebody who has a demand for some need, request for some need, and they are, you know, they're the buyers, right? Of this, it's buyers and sellers, and an intermediary, a platform that can now let somebody who needs their resume sharpened up or needs a set of PowerPoint slides, able to put that call out there and have somebody who has that experience or has that expertise or wants to give it a shot, they can sign up and meet that call and sell their labor. So I feel like, to me, you know, this is a moment of opportunity to say, if we're orienting to a world that is not, or, you know, is not structured by manufacturing products, even software printed on a CD-ROM, like that's not what's being sold, then what is the opportunity here to say, what does anybody entering the economy need? So, you know, a more radical move that I would hope we could make here is to say, rather than look for solidarity from workers fighting a specific employer, or even sectorally fighting a specific industry, why don't we equip all workers entering the workplace, no matter where that workplace might be, no matter how long they're there, with a set of essential benefits? Don't seek it from an individual employer, pool it. Because the reality is, all of Silicon Valley, as the stand-in for Wall Street, all industries are benefiting from being able to tap an endlessly streaming pool of contingent labor. We know that most of our job growth has come from temporary staffing and contingent labor. If we know that, then let's say, okay, that's now the new structure of jobs. People move in and out by choice or by no choice. Then what is it that every person should be able to access so that they could come in and out of these markets? Like most of the people we interviewed, it's not a choice. It's that they have families to care for, they have elders or children, they have other goals, and they're trying to find work that will accommodate their life goals and needs. So what if we go, why don't we organize around that? And I, you know, screaming in my head, I'm just going to say it out loud, is Gina Neff did this foundational work. Venture Labor is the name of the book. I recommend everybody check it out. There's a reason, there's a certain moment in history where every young middle class person of means thought, I'm now just going to be my own brand. That was the reality of the economic fallout of losing full-time employment across many sectors. So if we know that's happening on paper, then why don't we move toward advocating for some basics that meet everybody's needs, no matter where they work, how long they work, who they work for, that would allow them to come and go. Like if that's the valuable thing, let's make it valuable to workers too, because right now they're getting no value out of coming and going.
Mm-hmm.
Right,
Yeah.
and I would say, building on that, you know, one of the things I heard when surveying the tech workers while they're working from home right now is those who have children are obviously very concerned about how to balance work and family life right now. The lack of childcare options in regular times in this country is horrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And the ability, you know, to balance work and family life is very difficult on a daily basis, and it's just become even more difficult. And these are, you know, these are well-paid, privileged white-collar workers, and they're struggling. Some of them are single moms, some of them, you know, have partners. But the gender division of labor, even amongst, you know, households where you're both Amazon workers with engineering degrees, is that the woman tends to do more of the child rearing and the homeschooling and all of those things. Mm-hmm. And so what I heard from women was, I'm really concerned about my future because I'm able to work a little bit less or a lot less than I was before. I'm concerned that I'm less visible on projects because everyone's working from home. And so I'm really concerned about my next performance review, my next promotion, all of those things. And those are things that they were concerned about before, and this has just made it even more of a concern. And so childcare is just one of those issues. And then the other issues are how do the individual companies, or possibly if the sector were to work together, help these employees. You know, Microsoft offered an additional 12 weeks paid parental leave to deal with that in the spring, and Amazon basically refuses to even recognize that this is an issue. So the Amazon employees who I spoke to said, you know, we've been telling them that this is a problem, and they haven't even recognized it yet. They haven't even spoken publicly about it. So this is, you know, this is the situation where we are.
Yeah,
and the deep irony for the workers we studied, they were already dealing with this. They'd already figured out, like, I have to deal with this absurd inequality in the division of labor for caring for family and home. And that's part of what they were working through in taking these other on-demand work opportunities. So it's sad to say we have so much to learn from people who had already opted out of structured formal employment because it wasn't protecting their other interests.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, notably, Silicon Valley companies have notoriously offered all sorts of benefits, but not built childcare centers. You know, Apple opened its campus 3 years ago. It had a 2-story yoga studio and no childcare center. So it sort of speaks volumes about the priorities. There are a lot of we're getting close to our end, and there's a lot of questions that have come in about government and policy. It is a hot topic today. The House Judiciary Antitrust Subcommittee issued a very long report of their deliberations over the last couple of years, and I'm interested in let's talk a little bit about government policy. You guys know I have thoughts about that, and it's sort of the question. So I think this also goes to another question that is coming over the wire, which is sort of what have been the most effective strategies for collective action and for worker empowerment and for rectifying the lack of diversity and inequity within the workplace. And I'm thinking a lot about the 1930s, and I'm thinking about how during the Great Depression, the magnitude of the economic crisis and the critical role that the industrial sector played in the American economy and its revival, and the election of Franklin Roosevelt and a whole bunch of progressives who'd been kicking around ideas like, pro-labor policy and a national labor standards and protection of unionization for a very long time, and then they're empowered. And so you have workers win the right to organize. They get federal policy kind of coming in and giving them protections that allows unionization within industry to massively scale up. It's obviously not a straight path, but by the time you get to the 1950s, you have a high watermark of private sector unionization in the United States. And that is, policy played a role in that. That was obviously worker organizing was extraordinarily important, but you needed the feds to come in and say, you got to do this, and bring labor to the table and make them, a partner in policy making, and obviously a really critical Democratic Party constituency to this day. I'm curious about what you guys are thinking about policy and the new labor law as we close out.
Kimberly, I keep hogging the mic.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, at the end of the book, we actually list a set of recommendations, and one of the most important things that we see, I won't pin this on my co-author, but certainly that I see moving forward is recognizing the rights of workers to organize, no matter whether they're at a single work site or not. And a version of that is sectoral bargaining. There has to be a way for people who are on contract, who are freelancers effectively, to be able to represent their interests. So we could certainly come up with a mechanism that would allow individuals who see common cause to bring their grievances and their concerns or their requests forward to different industries that are hiring them. There's no reason that can't happen, and there are models for this in other parts of the world. So that's one thing. I mean, right now we call it an antitrust issue. Again, deep irony. It's an antitrust issue if you have 5 freelancers on Upwork get together and talk about barring the use of surveillance technologies on your projects. That shouldn't be the case. But probably more importantly, it's this basic, like, where did all of our safety net come from? It came from imagining a worker on a factory floor who needed protection. And it did not imagine that there was a basic need for giving a worker the right to control their schedule. It should be illegal that you don't know your schedule prior to when you step into work, or that your livelihood depends on you saying yes to a schedule you're just seeing for the first time within a short period of time. So being able to control when you work, being able to have a say in who you work with and what that relationship looks like, and that you can bring grievances forward in a transparent way so that, you know, bad actors can't scuttle off to a different company. And that people should have the right to be able to vie for working on projects that they have the capacity to contribute to, you know, to practice what it is that they want to practice. In a world where we're valuing not one person, we're valuing many people offering their services to, you know, to an economy that depends on them coming and going, testing out what they're doing. What would make that all entirely doable are a suite of portable benefits. I mean, I don't mean to make it simplistic, but the reality is in the United States, which is kind of kooky when we start talking about, you know, why it's so messed up here, is because we hitched every kind of basic material support to your employer instead of working, instead of employment. So that's, you know, that's what I would love for us all to consider, is that if every person, if every working age adult had access to healthcare for them and their families, parental leave, continuing education, a retirement plan, and the right to be able to collectively organize with their colleagues, we could meet a lot of our labor needs.
And I definitely second the idea of sectoral bargaining, you know, because it's obviously within the gig economy, it's, you know, people working for multiple platforms at the same time, moving around a lot, but even within the white collar tech workers, as Margaret mentioned, you know, one of the things within tech is that if you're unhappy, you just go to a different tech company. And there's a lot of movement amongst the companies. So there really has to be some sort of, you know, sectoral bargaining and organizing. And I'll just end with saying, you know, one of the interesting things about workers organizing within tech, it was, for example, the 2018 Google walkout and the retaliation that came after that. And so the, you know, two of the main organizers, two women, were sort of not just fired, but sort of their reports and responsibilities were taken away from them. They were leveled down and eventually left. And this is sort of how it's done within tech. But interestingly, you know, almost a year ago, 4 other workers at Google were all fired on the same day across the country who didn't know each other, who had been involved in various organizing campaigns. And so Google in particular seems to have taken this hard line against workers organizing, which is interesting because Google used to be the sort of friendly company where you were allowed to access data and everything at work, and now you're not allowed to do any of that. But what may come of that from taking such a hard line is that workers are actually talking about not just organizing, but possibly unionizing. Mm-hmm. And so when you have this, you know, sort of stamping out worker initiatives, it actually brings people who were just sort of on the sidelines and the periphery and not really paying too much attention. It brings those things to light, and it starts conversations that maybe wouldn't have happened before. So I see a little bit of hope there. And like I mentioned, this cross company collaboration organizing that began recently called Discotech is sort of I think an example of how people can get together across tech companies and talk about their similar experiences and sort of start working on those issues. So,
well, there are a lot of there are far more amazing questions that have come in that we aren't able to talk about. There's so many more things we could talk about, but we need to go. But before we do, I want to raise a glass of bubbly something to cheers Mary Gray for her MacArthur Fellowship. And also cheers to you when you really should have been hanging out, having a cocktail, spending your evening, your triumphant evening after this triumphant day, surprise day with us. So feel super lucky to have had this conversation. Kimberly, I'm so glad you've put together this report. I know how much time and work went into it, and I think this is extraordinarily important data. And I want to shout out to Kim and to Andrew Hedden and to Yasmin and to the entire Bridges Center team. I'm so honored to be on the standing committee and be part of the Bridges effort. And I hope that those of you who don't know the Bridges Center will get to know it. If you're on the UW campus, come be part of our community. And cheers to Mary, cheers to all of you, and let's hope for better days to come. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Bye.
Vote, 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 vote,
Vote,
vote.
vote, 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 vote.
Thank you. This was wonderful. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.